Following my challenge this year to paint some of the older models in my collection, I have found a Corvus Belli model, and that is always a good time. Specifically, this was a gift from Amethyst Quill, who let me take a single model from the Space Scottish 45th Highlander Rifles. Now, I've no idea when it comes to Infinity, I haven't played the game or know anything about the factions, but the models are excellent. Back when I was given this, I did actually film unboxing it and fitting the model to a base. And interestingly, this was an idea I had to make resin rocks using crumpled tin foil, but I never got it to work consistently. Importantly, if a model has a tab under the feet, do not ever cut it off. This is something that endlessly annoys me. I see well-known model makers tell noobs to cut away the tab, and then the noob has a model that never stands up ever again. You can modify it for sure, shorten it if needed, just use the tab. That's what it's for. Well, though that was years ago, so let's snap back to this year when I finally got around to getting some paint down. And for whatever reason, I just had to start with purple. Probably because painting purple on a kilt represents the thistles of Scotland. And I've also painted so much gritty, realistic World War II stuff recently that I just needed something with some real colour to it. This specific purple paint, unfortunately, it's kind of past its use. So I went with something I bought 20 years more recently and added some pink for a little bit of a highlight. On my wet palette, I also added some skin tone into this mix to base coat all of the skin, and I'm going to have to sidetrack myself at this point because I've gotten stuck into this model without even really considering anything about how I'm going to paint it, what colours I'm going to use, or anything about the art direction of the piece. I just knew that I wanted purple for the kilt, representing the Scottish thistle. Well, let's do some casual colour theory, kind of back of the napkin kind of stuff, and see what I can do with that purple. There are many different ways you can use the colour wheel, considering the primaries of cyan, magenta and yellow, and mixing those to make the secondaries orange, green and purple. For my initial purple, a simple opposed complementary would be yellow, and I wasn't really into that. I could radially support it using either blue or red, perhaps a little of both, and I actually really like the idea of using red and orange, as red would work really nicely for the belts and pouches. But I could also use a triad, which would give me the three secondaries, purple, orange and green, and now that was interesting. Once you've had a look at what colours you've chosen, you can think about how you're going to put them on the model and how you're going to use each one. You can use a bright saturated version of each of your 2 or 3 colours and have a super bright comic book style model, which can be great, but it's not the feeling I'm going for. You could use all 3 in a dark desaturated look for a gritty grimdark look, also cool, but I want somewhere in between these two, and so I have an idea. A decent saturation for one colour, and I've already put down my purple in that style. Desaturation for another, mixing in grey or black. And finally the third colour will be muted, which means mixing in brown to pull that third colour into the middle of the colour wheel. So with my purple being the bright colour, even though it's a relatively dark tone, it has the saturation. And my green, as second choice, will come in to fill the desaturated part of my idea. And mainly this will be the model's jacket, although the green does kind of subtly work its way into other parts of the model as well. My first layer, I mixed in a lot of black into the green, and over a couple of layers of highlights I went up to just the dark green unmixed. And I kind of liked where this was going, and I did like the desaturated shadows, but I wanted to push the highlights just a little bit, and so I added a tiny amount of yellow, highlighting by hue in this case, and added some really subtle spotty texture on just the highest parts of the jacket. I mentioned the green ended up in other parts of the model, like the boots, which I quickly highlighted with the green and black mix I still had on my wet palette, and I actually highlighted this up just into a fully grey paint to ensure that the boots and the jacket had a different look whilst maintaining that hue over the model. For the third part of my secondaries triad, My orange is going over all of the belts and pouches like I originally thought, and fully muted into brown in the shadows before subtly highlighting up to the orange. And as I was painting this, I was noticing that my kind of colour theory idea was starting to come together. The secondary triad with a bright, a desaturated and a muted mix for each one really suits. So I wanted to just fill in the rest of the details of the model to ensure that the colours do actually work for the effect that I'm after. The rifle had a really simple non-metallic effect, starting with black from my wet palette, which still had some of that green in it, but I highlighted up by mixing in a desaturated blue, blue-grey. And after that I gave just a few specular and edge highlights around the rifle with the blue-grey unmixed, and I wasn't really happy with how it was going, and so I filtered over the whole rifle with black. And it can be really difficult to filter or glaze with a darker colour, especially black, as darker colours generally have very good coverage, and the whole point of a filter is to not cover everything. But I did manage to tone everything down, and then I reapplied some very tiny specular highlights on top of my original ones, which gave a nice layered effect. Moving on to the skin, and I really need to sit down at some point and properly learn how to paint skin, because I kind of just bumbled through this model at this stage. My original mixed purple paint was a great base, but I wanted, as with other parts of the model, to darken it for my shadows. And I started that by glazing on some dark brown over everything, trying to ensure that it was a smooth, even layer. This glaze of dark colour was much heavier than my earlier black filter on the rifle, but it was still thin enough that the purple was still noticeable, so I pretty much got it perfectly. I highlighted this by mixing in all sorts of paint together, adding in some medium skin tone to my wet palette, which had the orange and the dark brown. And this didn't look right by itself, and so I added a spot of a very bright red, which helped, but it still wasn't quite right. And for the next step, I added in some black and repainted the shadows, kind of picking out the recesses of the skin, pulling back some of the contrast that I'd lost. In quite a few videos I've made over the years, I drop this whole part of the video where I paint the skin, as it's my weakest point. But I wanted to show it today to encourage others that if there is some part of painting that you struggle with, give it a try, get some practice, and you will improve somewhat. Go find some teaching resources, and then with that you can turn your practice into deliberate practice, and that really helps you improve. And that's really why I have to go away and actually learn how to paint skin, rather than just forcing myself at it every model. Well, I finished up painting the skin with a lighter Caucasian paint, and I was hoping to use this quite sparingly to act as only the brightest highlight, but I think I used a little too much of it and it lightened the skin more than I had intended. I also tried to stripe this in, showing the kind of muscle structure under the skin, but again this went a little too far from what I had intended. With just the hair remaining, I want to show a nice easy way to highlight shiny hair that I nearly know how to do. Start by ensuring that the initial coat is nice and opaque, however many coats that takes, and then make a really subtle highlight over the bulges in the hair as a whole. Ignore the individual hairs and highlight the hair as if it's one big piece. And this can be a very subtle highlight at first, and I'll highlight a second time to make it a little stronger. In the case of my model here, the bulges in the hair that I'm talking about will appear around the crown and also the flick at the base of the hair. And once you've got that base highlight sorted, then you can pick out the individual hairs, again fairly subtly at first, but I'm slowly increasing the brightness with every step, pushing further and further into white. Whilst picking out the individual hairs on the sculpt, make sure that this step of highlight doesn't drift outside of your larger highlight from the previous steps. For me, the final step was pure white, and that's just on the absolute finest points of the individual hairs and a little bit extra on the front to frame the face, and my model is done. Overall, I'm really happy with this one. I love painting Corvus Belli models, their models are really nice quality, and I really liked playing around with the colour theory as well. especially given how much World War II stuff I've painted, really. And it led me into this really interesting but solid secondary triad. As I mentioned, this is another entry in my year's challenge to paint the older models from my collection rather than just the new stuff that I am excited about, because I keep buying new stuff. And I'm really enjoying this challenge, picking out some of this older stuff like the Space Scott today, and I really hope I keep it up for the whole year. I've been consistent so far, we'll see how it goes. Let me know in the comments what you think of my colour theory ideas, the secondary triads with a bright, a desaturated and a muted option, but also tell me if you've painted all those models that you told me about in my last challenge video. I know that you've been painting away at home, and tell me what you'll be getting done for next time. But for now, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.